Deep in the rugged hills of Pennsylvania, beneath the quiet canopy of the Susquehanna Valley, lies a secret that was never meant to see the light of day. Imagine a team of 19th century miners, deep in a vein of iron ore, striking something that shouldn't exist, a massive, polished stone sarcophagus. Inside, a skeleton of impossible proportions, nearly 9 feet tall, resting in a tomb that defies the primitive tools of the industrial age. What if I told you the history of the American Industrial Revolution was actually built on top of the graves of giants, and that the very mines that fueled our steel mills were actually ancient sites being systematically scrubbed from the record with tons of industrial-grade concrete? Today, we dive into the dark heart of Pennsylvania to uncover the lost iron mine and the secrets buried beneath the seal. To the average tourist, Chickies Rock is just a scenic overlook, a towering quartzite cliff standing high above the Susquehanna River in Lancaster County. But for those who know how to read the landscape, this region is a massive crime scene of suppressed history. Official records tell us this area was nothing more than a hub for 19th century iron production, where men labored to fuel the expansion of the American railroad. They call it the Lost Iron Mine, but the legends whispered by locals and independent researchers tell a far more disturbing story. They speak of the stone coffins, immense geometric granite boxes found deep within the earth that were far too heavy and far too advanced for the era. Modern hikers still stumble upon the evidence. Vertical shafts in the middle of nowhere, capped with massive, unusually thick plugs of industrial concrete. If these legends are true, and giants truly occupied these hills, then the entire timeline of human habitation in North America is a carefully constructed lie. Why would the government go to such lengths to seal off a series of exhausted mine shafts in the woods of Pennsylvania? But to understand what is missing, we first have to look at what the history books tell us is true. The official history of Lancaster County's iron industry reads like a classic American success story. It begins in 1845, a time of steam and smoke, when the first great blast furnaces like the Henry Clay and the Chickies were erected along the riverbanks. According to the history books, this was an era of unprecedented progress. Miners were simply extracting hematite and magnetite ore to satisfy the insatiable hunger of the burgeoning railroad boom. For 50 years, the region was a powerhouse of production. But then, almost overnight at the turn of the century, the fires went out. By 1900, the official narrative claims the mines were simply exhausted. The industry moved west, the workers left, and the mountains were handed back to nature. But if you look closer at the official documents, the red flags begin to appear almost immediately. First, let's talk about the geology. Chickies Rock is composed primarily of Chickies quartzite, one of the hardest, most stubborn rock formations in the entire Appalachian chain. Quartzite has a Mohs hardness of about 7. To cut through it requires immense energy and specialized tools. Why would 19th century miners, equipped with little more than hand drills and primitive black powder, choose the most difficult terrain on the continent? Some researchers believe they weren't looking for ore at all. They were digging into the mountainside because they were following a path that had already been cleared by someone else thousands of years prior. Then there is the issue of the depth. Mining records from the late 1800s describe vertical shafts plunging hundreds of feet into the earth, far deeper than necessary to reach the surface-level iron deposits typical of the region. What were they really chasing at those depths? And why, during the mid-20th century, specifically between the 1920s and the 1950s, was there a sudden, urgent mission to seal these shafts with high-grade concrete? The state justifies this as a safety precaution to keep hikers from falling. But think about the economics of that for a moment. We are talking about the Great Depression era and the post-war years. Why would the government authorize the massive expense of hauling tons of industrial concrete into the deep, trackless woods just to plug a worthless hole? If a mine is empty, you board it up or let it collapse. You don't entomb it in a casing that would take a diamond-tipped drill to penetrate. You only pour that much concrete when you want to make sure that whatever is at the bottom of that shaft never sees the light of day again. The official record says they were protecting the public. But the newspapers from the years leading up to the sealing tell a very different, much more terrifying story of what the miners actually bumped into in the dark. If you want to find the truth, you have to look at the records created before the era of centralized information management. In the late 19th century, local newspapers like the Lancaster Intelligencer and the Reading Eagle were not under the thumb of global archaeological foundations. They reported what the people on the ground actually saw. Between 1880 and 1910, a series of startling reports emerged from the Pennsylvania Iron Country. During the construction of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the expansion of the iron works, miners began uncovering skeletal remains of unusual stature. We aren't talking about 6-footers. These reports, often found in the 1880 Census and Geological Report of Lancaster County, describe individuals standing 7, 8, and even 9 feet tall. One specific account from the late 1800s describes miners striking a stone chamber deep within the quartzite. Inside, they found a row of what appeared to be stone coffins. But these weren't primitive burials. According to reports cited by the North American Antiquarian Society in 1892, these sarcophagi were made of a stone that didn't match the local geology. They were described as polished and geometric, featuring precise angles that suggested a high-speed machining process, not a hammer and chisel. The official response today is that these were simply misidentified animal bones or distorted burials of local indigenous tribes. But let's look at the mathematics of these finds. One famous discovery near Conneaut Lake involved a femur bone that was nearly half the height of the man who found it. In forensic anthropology, we use a specific formula to calculate height from a femur. It looks like this. Dolic du 226 times Teklenenst plus 6638 text CMD's dollars. When you plug in the measurements reported in these historical archives, you aren't looking at a tall human. You are looking at a biological anomaly, a giant. Even the New York Times got in on the action back then. Before they became the paper of record that protects the status quo, they published dozens of articles about giant skeletons being unearthed across the Appalachian Range. What makes the Pennsylvania finds unique is the presence of the stone coffins. The local Susquehannock people, who inhabited this valley in the 1600s, were a powerful and tall people, often described by Captain John Smith as being remarkably large. However, even the Susquehannock didn't possess the technology to quarry, polish, and move multi-ton granite sarcophagi into deep subterranean chambers. So, who did? The descriptions of these chambers don't sound like mines. They sound like pre-existing vaults that were discovered by the 19th century ironworkers. Think about the implications of the date 1892. This was exactly when the official closing of the mines began. As soon as these stone chambers were documented, the flow of information began to dry up. Imagine being a worker in 1890. You've been told you are digging for iron to build the modern world. But then you break through a wall and find the remains of a civilization that was more advanced than your own. You find skeletons that make you look like a child. You find stonework that your own engineers couldn't replicate without steam-powered diamond saws. Would the captains of industry, the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, want that information getting out? Or would they see this inherited technology as something to be privatized and hidden? These aren't just myths. They are documented finds by the very people who built the foundation of the United States. But as the 19th century turned into the 20th, a curtain was pulled across these discoveries. The skeletons were shipped off to institutions like the Smithsonian, never to be seen again. And the sites themselves were slated for decommissioning. But why go through the trouble of sealing the mines with concrete if the skeletons were already gone? Unless, of course, the skeletons were just the beginning. What if the mines themselves were part of something much bigger? A global network that the history books have spent over a century trying to erase. This is where the story shifts from a local mystery to a global conspiracy involving a lost empire known as Tartaria. If you follow the evidence long enough, you realize that the lost iron mine isn't an isolated incident. It is a small piece of a much larger global puzzle that researchers often refer to as the Tartarian Empire. According to the Great Reset theory, the window between 1850 and 1920 wasn't just a time of industrial growth. It was a period of systemic erasure, a cleaning of the slate. In this framework, the massive iron and steel infrastructure of Pennsylvania wasn't invented by the pioneers and the industrial titans. It was inherited. Imagine the Susquehanna River Valley as it might have looked before the official settlers arrived. It wasn't a wilderness. It was a post-catastrophic landscape filled with the ruins of a global civilization. Tartaria is described as a vast, technologically advanced empire that utilized atmospheric energy and possessed a mastery over stone and metal that we are only now beginning to understand. When the 19th century founders of our current system moved into Pennsylvania, they didn't just build factories, they excavated them. Look at the masonry of the old iron furnaces near Chickee's Rock. If you strip away the modern additions, the base structures often feature precision-cut megalithic blocks. These stones are fitted together with such accuracy that you couldn't slide a razor blade between them. This is the same Starfort-style masonry found in Russia, Europe, and Asia. Is it a coincidence that the same architectural Dina appears in the middle of the Pennsylvania woods, allegedly built by simple laborers in the 1840s? Some researchers believe the lost iron mine wasn't a mine at all. Under the Tartarian model, these shafts were part of a massive subterranean energy grid. Iron is a highly conductive material. The veins of ore might have been utilized as natural conduits for an atmospheric energy system that powered a pre-flood world. If this is true, then the giant skeletons found in the stone coffins weren't just random prehistoric people. They were the original architects. They were the operators of this global grid. Their height and biological makeup might have been perfectly suited for a world with a different atmospheric pressure or a different electromagnetic frequency. This brings us to the most controversial part of the theory, the mud flood. Tartarian researchers point to evidence of a global cataclysm, a literal reset, that occurred shortly before the 1800s, burying the lower levels of Old World structures in feet of sediment. When the 19th century miners discovered the iron mines of Pennsylvania, they were actually digging through the debris of this event to reclaim the technology buried beneath. They found the furnaces, they found the shafts, and deep in the lowest levels, where the mud hadn't fully penetrated, they found the creators of the system still resting in their stone vaults. Now ask yourself, if you were the new leaders of the world in 1880, would you tell the public the truth? Would you tell them that free energy is possible and that a race of giants once ruled the land? Or would you claim that you invented the blast furnace yourself? By claiming the technology as their own, the industrial titans could monetize it. They could charge for power. They could control the narrative of progress. But there was a problem. The physical evidence, the massive skeletons, and the megalithic vaults proved they were liars. This is why the timeline of the lost iron mine is so suspicious. The reports of giants peaked right as the industrial era was solidifying its power. To maintain the illusion, the evidence had to disappear. Not just the bones, but the very access points to the old world. The sealing of the mines wasn't about safety. It was about narrative security. If you can't move a 10-ton granite sarcophagus out of a deep quartzite shaft, you do the next best thing. You entomb it. You pour thousands of gallons of high-grade concrete down that shaft, effectively turning the ancient vault into a time capsule that no one can ever open. The concrete caps we see today near Chickies Rock are the period at the end of a sentence that was written to end the story of Tartaria in America. They tell us the concrete was poured to prevent accidents. But notice how these seals are almost always located over the specific shafts where the anomalies were reported. They didn't seal every hole in the ground. They sealed the ones that led to the old world. In the 1930s, during the height of the Works Progress Administration, thousands of men were sent into the forests of the eastern United States. While they were supposedly building trails and parks, they were also reclaiming old industrial sites. Is it possible that their real mission was to find every remaining access point to the Tartarian grid and cap it with concrete? The sheer volume of cement used in these woods is staggering. We are talking about thousands of tons of material transported into difficult terrain. Calculate the cost of the logistics alone. In a time of economic hardship, why was this a priority? Because the New World Order of the 20th century couldn't risk a single hiker finding a stone door that led to a 9-foot-tall reality. They needed us to believe that we were the pinnacle of evolution, that before us there was only wilderness and primitive people. But the stones of Pennsylvania remember a different story. And as we'll see in the next section, modern technology is starting to peer through the concrete. Even today, with all the suppression and the state park designations, the ghosts of the giants are still making themselves known. If the concrete was meant to be a permanent seal, it's failing, because the truth has a way of leaking out, one void at a time. The concrete was supposed to be the end of the story. For decades, the massive plugs at Chickies Rock and the surrounding iron country sat silent, slowly being reclaimed by moss and forest floor debris. The authorities likely thought the lost iron mine was a closed chapter, but in the 21st century, the advent of affordable, high-tech surveying equipment has changed the game for independent researchers. In recent years, several teams using ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, have ventured into the restricted zones of the Susquehanna Valley. What they've found beneath the surface is chilling. GPR works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring the reflections. When these pulses hit the empty mine shafts, the results should show jagged, irregular tunnels typical of 19th century hand digging. Instead, researchers have reported voids that display perfect geometric symmetry. We are talking about rectangular rooms and perfectly circular shafts that do not match the crude mining maps on file with the state. These anomalies suggest that the concrete doesn't just fill a hole, it acts as a lid for a sophisticated, subterranean architecture that was never meant to be explored by the public. If these were just abandoned iron mines, why are the voids so precise? And why does the geometry of these rooms align with the same solar and magnetic orientations found in megalithic sites across the globe? This brings us to the role of the Pennsylvania History and Museum Commission, or PHMC. Today, these sites are often designated as hazardous zones or protected heritage sites. On the surface, it sounds responsible. But for any independent archaeologist, it's a bureaucratic brick wall. Private excavation is strictly prohibited, and even bringing GPR equipment into certain areas can result in heavy fines or trespassing charges. Why is an exhausted mine from the 1880s treated with the same level of security and secrecy as a modern military installation or a nuclear waste site? If you go to Chickies Rock today, you can find the seals. They are massive industrial-grade slabs of concrete, often feet thick, poured directly into the throat of the mountain. Look at the weathered edges of these plugs. In some areas, the forest has eroded the surrounding soil, revealing that the concrete isn't just a surface cap. It's a deep structural injection designed to fill the tomb entirely. Independent explorers have documented instances where these seals appear much more recent than the 1930s, suggesting that whenever a new void is discovered or a shaft begins to open due to erosion, the state returns to pour more. The question we have to ask is, who is paying for this? Who benefits from the continued maintenance of these concrete secrets in the middle of a public park? The suppression isn't just physical, it's institutional. When researchers present these GPR findings or historical newspaper clippings to state archaeologists, they are met with a standardized dismissal. They are told the giants were a hoax, the stone coffins were natural erosion, and the concrete is for the hikers. But the evidence of our own eyes suggests otherwise. The silent sentinels of Pennsylvania, these concrete scars on the landscape, serve as a constant reminder that something immense is still down there, waiting. And as the earth continues to shift and the old world structures beneath our feet begin to settle, the safety narrative is becoming harder and harder to maintain. Why does any of this matter in the 21st century? Why should we care about a few sealed mine shafts or the bones of a race that vanished long ago? The answer lies in the fundamental way our society is structured. Our entire modern identity is built on a specific, linear view of progress. We are taught that humanity started as primitive hunter-gatherers and slowly climbed the ladder to where we are today. But if we admit that a giant, technologically advanced civilization like Tartaria existed right here in the American heartland, that entire ladder collapses. If we acknowledge that these mines were actually part of an ancient energy network, we have to admit that we aren't at the peak of human achievement, we are living in the ruins of a much greater world. This is why the suppression is so fierce. Academic institutions and government agencies have built their entire reputations on the official story. If they were to admit they've been hiding the existence of giants and inherited technology, they would lose their most valuable asset, their credibility as the sole arbiters of truth. But there is an even more practical reason for the cover-up. It's about the resource monopoly. Our world runs on the scarcity of energy. We pay for electricity, for gas, and for heating, because we are told that these are rare and difficult to produce. But if the Pennsylvania Iron Works were actually free energy hubs, if the atmosphere itself can be tapped for power, as the Tartarians supposedly did, then the current energy conglomerates lose their power over us overnight. By pouring concrete over the lost iron mine, they weren't just burying skeletons, they were burying our potential for energy independence. They were burying a history where we weren't just cogs in an industrial machine, but heirs to a global legacy of abundance. The Smithsonian and other major organizations are often accused of being the black hole of history, the place where the physical evidence goes to die. But as long as those concrete seals remain in the woods of Lancaster County, the evidence is still under our feet. Every time you pay an electric bill or look at a modern bridge that seems to be falling apart while Tartarian masonry stands strong, you are seeing the result of that suppression. The concrete is thick, but the truth is starting to crack through the surface. Pennsylvania's lost iron mine is more than just a local legend. It is a physical gateway to a history we were never supposed to rediscover. We have the archived newspaper reports from a time when the truth was still allowed to breathe. We have the physical concrete seals that defy logical industrial explanation. And most of all, we have the architectural anomalies that suggest our ancestors weren't just mining, they were reclaiming a legacy left behind by the architects of the old world. The concrete is heavy, and the institutional walls are high, but history isn't owned by the commissions or the papers of record. It belongs to those who are willing to look. The lost iron mine isn't just a mine. It's a tomb for a giant and a vault for a truth they don't want you to remember. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you found these massive, out-of-place concrete seals in your local woods? Have you dug into the 19th century archives of your own hometown? Share your findings in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to help us break through the algorithm. The truth is under our feet. We just have to keep digging.